Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Officially, the Church will not take any position on the religious implications of these phenomena. Personally, Lenny, I think it's a sign from God.
Hello and welcome to the podcast, another exciting episode of the Apologetics 315 podcast with our special guest host, as always, Chad Gross.
I'm very special that I'm always here. I am excited, man, about today's interview. Craig Keener, the man whose name has become synonymous with miracles and the miraculous and claims of miracles. So I'm looking forward to learning about his new book.
Yes, well, if you've read the 2-volume tome about his miracles in the New Testament, you believe in miracles because you got through it. No, it was so huge. But yeah, it's like self-fulfilling. Today we're interviewing Craig Keener. He's a New Testament scholar. He's done his PhD work in the New Testament and Christian origins at Duke University. He's got a lot of Bible background and commentaries. Over 1 million of his 30-plus books are in circulation and have won 13 national and international awards. So at this point, he just drops the mic. No, he doesn't. He keeps writing, but now he's writing about miracles. The first one we just mentioned there was his 2-volume work is Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts. But today we're talking to him about his most recent book, Miracles Today, the Supernatural Work of God in the Modern World. If you read the New Testament one, great, but this one is almost like a shorter version. Like part of the thing he says in the book, Chad, is he says, you want to have something to hand someone on a plane when they ask you about miracles, and the 2-volume thing will like break his arm or something. So
Right.
he had to have something smaller. So that's great. He's also been interviewed by Lee Strobel in Lee Strobel's book, A Case for Miracles. So that might be another one where you could slip into someone's back pocket, so to speak. But for a really cool book, the breadth of topics that he covers in this Miracles book in the Modern World are really cool. So are miracles happening today? Have they even been documented? What sort of evidential value do they have for Christianity? We want to know, how does this relate to apologetics and our faith in general? So we've got a lot of different questions about how do we evaluate miracle claims? What sort of evidence do we count as legitimate for looking at miracle claims? That sort of thing.
One of the things I think is great about this book is, like you mentioned, that it's kind of a condensed, reader-friendly version of, his more scholarly work. I'm just looking forward to hearing more about how he chooses the miracle accounts that are credible and worth reporting. I'm also looking forward to hearing about which of the ones that he's been sent or he's investigated, which ones he finds most compelling. And then also we have a number of objections that we want to kind of throw at him that I know that online, whenever the topic of miracles come up, whether from a Christian or an atheist, typically Professor Keener's name is not too far behind. And so I'm interested to hear about what he thinks in regard to when someone brings certain presuppositions to the topic, how that affects how they interpret the data. And then also, how much can the data tell us?
We're also kind of reading J. Warner Wallace's upcoming book, Person of Interest, which is awesome.
Yeah, super interesting.
Dual book plug at the moment, but it would be cool to get these two together. And it would be cool to get J. Warner Wallace and Craig Keener and talk about miracles, their claims, and the evidence, because J. Warner Wallace coming from the detective standpoint and, well, what sort of evidence do you look for? How do you make a case that a certain thing happened? What's the best explanation? Are these witnesses credible? That sort of thing. That would be kind of interesting. But I also think about when I'm reading through this book, like if you opened up to any random page and you read the account, if I'm thinking with a skeptical hat on, I could say, well, I want some more information. Maybe this person wasn't credible.
Or this is just an anomaly.
Now, I think that basically taking some of the best evidenced accounts into the book, but the other thing would be, though, if you just pulled out one at random, sure, you can poke holes in it and raise questions. That doesn't mean just because you can raise a question that it's not good, like a good case or a good documentation of a miracle claim. However, when you go through that whole book, one after another, because I'm thinking, okay, I'm not going to have time to finish this book for the interview, but I'm going to go through every page and look at it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, you got tumors healed. You got people coming back from drownings when there was like things that were taking place that really are not conducive to that. You got brain tumors like healed. You got people getting cured from MS. You get all kinds of stuff. And you've got doctors' reports and all of this. So when you put that all together, making a cumulative case, and the power of a cumulative case is that to knock it down, you got to knock down quite a bit of stuff. You got to basically be hyper skeptical about everything.
Yeah.
Every single page you'd have to say, well, there's a naturalistic explanation. No, well, this is psychosomatic. How long are you just going to do that? You might as well just be a broken record.
Well, and I think, too, that what's interesting is a lot of times when miracle claims are objected to, a lot of times that there's not a criterion that someone is using. It just seems like they're able to kind of crank up their skeptic dial higher and higher and higher, regardless of how good the claim is. And so I think one of the things I want to ask Professor Keener is, what is your criteria for determining, what is your criteria for determining what miracles are credible? And I think that skeptics, though, should do the same. What is your criteria? And if your criteria is nothing will convince me that a miracle never happened, then maybe you should rethink your criteria.
So we're looking forward to speaking with Dr. Keener today. So we hope you enjoy the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Craig Keener, thanks for joining us for the podcast.
It's great to be with you, Brian.
Well, me and Chad have been looking forward to this interview for a while. We were so excited that you were available to do that. You've got a book coming out in October, sort of a smaller, more reader-friendly version, or maybe I should say easier to carry than a 2-tome volume on New Testament miracles. But this is Miracles Today, the Supernatural Work of God in the Modern World. I guess the first thing we'd like to start off with is you've authored over 30 books, scholarly academic works and commentaries, that sort of thing. And as I look at it, I kind of think, well, in a way, this book is sort of shifting. Your work on miracles, in a way, is shifting from looking at God's Word, in a way, to looking at God's works in the world, so to speak. So what compelled you to look into miracles, not just the New Testament miracles, but miracles in the modern world?
Thanks. It actually flowed out of my commentary writing. I was doing what became a 4-volume commentary on Acts. If I'd known it was going to be 4,500 pages when I started, I wouldn't have started. But anyway, when I was doing the introduction, one of the objections people often raise to the historical reliability of Acts, and actually it was the foundational objection really to the historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts to begin with, historically, was that they include miracle accounts. And some people have said, well, these can't go back to eyewitnesses because eyewitnesses would never claim anything like this. Well, I'm like, where have you been living? I mean, I know plenty of eyewitnesses who claim things like this. And so I just figured, well, I don't want to just cite people I know, or even things I've witnessed myself. Let me go back and just find a couple books to put in the footnote that, just researched a few of these claims, or maybe a dissertation somewhere, a missiology dissertation or something like that, that history dissertation that just lists some of these reports directly from eyewitnesses. And eventually I found more works, but initially when I started, I was finding things here and there, and the footnote kept growing and growing. And after 200 pages, it was even too long for a chapter. So, by the time it was 1,100 pages, it was definitely its own book. That was the first book. But I've been convinced for a long time. I mean, you look at responses on the internet, you've got people who would make claims for the book, which they would then either refute, or they would say, look what Keener has proved that I actually didn't say in the book. So I thought, well, all right, to be fair, most people aren't going to read through 1,100 pages. So let me do a shorter one so people can actually read it and not just talk about it. And, because some of the people coming from a more skeptical perspective, they'd cite certain examples that I wasn't saying these are absolute proof. I was just saying, here is an assortment of the kind of claims people make. But anyway, so in this book, I'm trying to focus especially on newer reports. So I won't, put the old one out of print, but also, some of the more compelling reports. And I guess my interest in this also just goes back to the fact that I was converted from atheism. And when I was an atheist, of course, I didn't believe in miracles. But if somebody had given me this kind of evidence, I would have converted. Now, as it was, I converted without this kind of evidence, but it would have helped me. And I think it can help a lot of people to see that, the kinds of evidence that people are saying, well, I didn't see that. Well, some people have seen that. These things do go back to, well, not always, but they can go back to eyewitnesses. They can represent authentic claims.
Yeah. So basically what I hear you saying is the way that miracles today, the supernatural work of God in the modern world, is different from your 2-volume work, Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts, is that the newer book is more like for the layman, more for the person who isn't going to read through 1,100 pages, but also it has newer accounts. Are those kind of the two big key differences?
Yeah, I mean, and I included some of the older accounts, but I'd say like 3/4 of it is newer material. And the big thing was to make it more reader friendly. So, people wouldn't have to wade through a couple hundred pages of discussing Hume and Humeans and so forth. I mean, I deal with it briefly, but I wanted to focus more on the positive material.
Yeah. So one of the things too, I mean, chapter 1 of the book, your new book, is appropriately asked the question, what is a miracle? And considering the topic of the interview today is, of course, your new book, but that's about miracles. It seems kind of like a good place to start for you to offer a definition of miracle for us.
One reason I had to start there was because there's no universally agreed definition of a miracle. The New Testament, the word that's usually translated miracles just means powers or expressions of God's power. Probably functions more like, say, what you have in Luke Acts, pretty similar to the word sign. But in terms of how it's often used today, David Hume's definition was in the 1700s that it's a violation of natural law. Now, that was a convenient definition for him because he said natural law by definition can't be violated. So a violation of natural law, therefore, is a contradiction in terms, which is just playing with words. It's because of how he defined it, and then also how we define natural law, which is not the way people today define natural law, certainly not the way philosophers of science define natural law. So a more traditional approach through history was that miracles are things that they're not against nature. God can use nature to accomplish them, but they transcend nature. That's Augustine's approach. If you say they violate nature, you're kind of saying, okay, well, he's taking the position of his day, like Isaac Newton and the Newtonians talked about natural law. But when they thought of natural law, they thought of God as the lawgiver, and they didn't think God was subject to the law. And therefore, they said, God can do miracles. But Hume came along and basically made it illegal for God to do miracles, just playing with those.
Based on his definition.
Based on his definition.
Right.
So it's kind of humorous in a way. Hume-orous. Sorry, that was. I shouldn't be making fun of him posthumously, but anyway, people have a lot of scholars published by Oxford, major university presses have issued critiques of that particular essay of Hume's, saying it doesn't really match up to his intellectual stature in some of his other essays. But yeah, if you take it not as a violation of nature, but as something that, the odds are so great against it happening on its own. So for instance, the Israelites get to the sea and the army is pursuing them and they're going to be in big trouble, but the sea parts before them and they cross the sea. Well, there is such a thing as wind set down. You can have a natural phenomenon where water can part, but the timing, it doesn't fit the explanation of a coincidence very well. I mean, the odds of it are so improbable. So God can work through natural causes. The Bible says in Exodus 14, he blew back the sea with a strong east wind. So, I mean, that's not a violation of nature by any means. But Hume himself would not consider that to be, he would say, I'm sure that didn't happen, but if it did happen, he would, I think, say, okay, that fits, that's a miracle. But most of the miracles in the Bible, apart from the resurrection of Jesus and the creation and the virgin birth, most of the miracles in the Bible couldn't even be classified as violations of nature.
Well, I was wondering, when you've looked at all these different accounts, the various accounts of miracles, and you even mentioned in the book that people send them to you. Yes. Some of them are obviously more credible than others. For example, somebody on Facebook shared with me an article from Christianity Today about this pastor who allegedly went to heaven, and he has pictures to prove it. And yeah.
You have to buy the pictures. He's selling the pictures, though.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind.
So nice camera. I want to get a camera like that.
Yeah, no doubt, right? But one of the things that got me wondering, because I knew we were going to speak with you about this topic, is, do you have a type of criterion that helps you kind of sift through, okay, these are worth putting in my work, and okay, these don't cut the mustard?
Yeah, I actually, because of the way the discussion is framed today, I actually use some of Hume's criteria. So, they have to be credible witnesses. Mm-hmm. So in this case, they have to have a good track record of credibility, something at stake to lose if they're lying. And also, I like to get independent verification if I can, from other witnesses. It's not always possible, but I try to do that, and also check medical documentation when that's possible. Obviously, for the parting of the sea, you wouldn't get medical documentation. You'd want to look at meteorology or something. But
sure.
But in each case, I try to verify as well as I can, which does mean that some things have better evidence than others. So everybody has a kind of a level of burden of proof that they ask for. So some people are going to have a higher level for that than others. I've had a couple people actually, both of them with PhDs, who have said, well, I don't accept this, I don't accept that. I said, if somebody were raised from the dead in front of you, would you accept it? They said no. And I'm like, okay, well, they have a very high bar of evidence that they require, and nothing is going to persuade them, but that's not my fault. That's their presuppositions.
Yes.
One question I had is along this line. There are some miracle claims are ambiguous in the sense that they could be taken as a miracle by those who want to interpret it that way. So the real cause could be cited as, oh, that was psychosomatic or a coincidence or something like that. But other claims seem to be more evidential in the way that they're undeniably, say, medically impossible. And you give an example of someone with MS with less than a week to live, and they recover completely and instantly, and there's just, that's healing is sustained for decades. They're almost more like this is an undeniable miracle, where the doctors are saying, well, it was there and now it's gone, and I have no way to account for this. We have the before and we have the after, and both the before and the after are highly documented, not because they were expecting it, but because that just happened to be the case, and the people were praying. So those are ones where it seems to me that the witnesses that happened to be there are in a position where they can't doubt their own experience in those two cases. But so the first sort of ones, the ambiguous ones, they seem to be the ones that you're not really looking for. You're looking for, in this book, the way you're documenting things, you're looking for things that, like, listen, here is the before and the after, and they're well documented with good, credible witnesses. And here's what people were doing. They were praying and they were asking for, a healing or a miracle or whatever. And this happened. We don't have any other explanation available to us to account for this, unless the skeptic wants to make some real stretches or point to coincidence or something psychosomatic. But even in the case where some of these miracles are happening, the person who received it, so to speak, they didn't know it. There were people praying for them. How could it be psychosomatic, So talk to us about what type of miracles you're trying to get.
Yeah, some are more evidence than others. So in the case of the two Barbaras, Just coincidentally, they happen to be named Barbara. Coincidences do happen. I'm definitely not denying that. But I also happened to select two of them that happen to be named Barbara, heuristic purposes. But the first one, this was a few years after my conversion. I was helping at a nursing home Bible study. There's a lady who came every week. She always would say she wished she could walk. She wished she could walk. She was always bound to her wheelchair. And finally, one day, the Bible study leader walked over to her, grabbed her by the hand, and said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk." And you could tell by the expression on her face that she was horrified. I was too. I thought she was going to fall on the floor. And he walked her around the room. And from then on, Barbara could walk, and she would come to the Bible study saying, "I love my Bible study. I love my Bible study." Now, I think that one's fairly strong. It wasn't psychosomatic on her part. You can say, well, maybe it was a lucky guess. Maybe she just could walk and didn't think she could walk.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't have the medical records in that case. I never was thinking back then, that many decades ago, writing a book on it. So, but then the other case of this other Barbara, she was, like you said, she was dying. She'd been sent home from the hospital. She'd been deteriorating from this condition for 15 years. She was unable to, she wasn't just unable to walk. I mean, she said she was curled up like a pretzel.
Mm-hmm.
Her hands would have to be pried open every, month or two to get the dead skin out. She wasn't able to use her muscles, even her diaphragm. She had to have something hooked up to circulate oxygen in her. That's the condition she was in because she couldn't breathe on her own. Somebody had sent in a prayer request to the radio station, and hundreds of people sent their letters saying, we're praying. And so some friends came over and began reading the letters to her, so she did have that. But suddenly she heard a voice off to the side, out where the window was. There shouldn't have been any voice coming from there saying, "My child, rise up and walk." She jumps out of bed, which she shouldn't have been able to do. Her feet land flat on the floor, which should have been impossible. She sees them. She sees her hands uncurled, and then she notices that she's no longer blind. I left that part out. And, in most cases where a healing like this takes place, the muscles will be atrophied because, you haven't walked for years. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be able to you're going to need to build up some muscle tone to be able to do it even when you've been healed. But in this case, her muscles were they were completely unatrophied, if that's a word, so that she runs out and greets her father. Now, I talked with the doctors, two of the doctors on this. I have the written report from another of the doctors. 3 doctors all attest this as a miracle. Before and after, they knew all this. And it didn't recur. This was like 1980s, early 1980s, and she's going strong. We have a number of cases like that. So those are kind of, I think those are hard to explain as something other than God acting.
Yeah. And even the doctor there, Dr. Marshall, was one of the doctors that worked with her. And the quote from the book, he says, "I'll be the first to tell you, you're completely healed." This is what he said to her. "I can also tell you that this is medically impossible."
Dr. Keener, one thing that maybe people have in mind when they say miracles or healing is they have this picture in their head of some big rally with a preacher at the front with a big shiny looking suit on and the band playing and asking for money and people falling over and that sort of thing. When I read through your book, I don't see any of that. I'm seeing people in, like you're saying, in a hospital bed where people have prayed and they're healed, or someone who has got a tumor and the tumor goes away.
Right.
When you're looking through there, you're not looking for like faith healing rallies. You're looking for other things where there's like medical reports and things before and after. How would you sort of categorize the situations, if you will?
God can heal anywhere. So I'm not saying God can't heal at those places. In fact, I'd like to share a story of one from a setting like that. But I didn't want to focus on those by any means because, somebody can always say, well, the person has a pecuniary interest in circulating this testimony or something like that. But there was Lisa Larios. She had reticulum cell sarcoma of the right pelvic bone. She had hip cancer. And it had metastasized. So it was spreading through her body. Her hip had been eaten away. The bone had been eaten away. So she was not only incapable of walking, but she was terminal. They had given her, I think 6 months to live, or maybe a year. And her parents hadn't told her yet what she had. She just knew that she was unable to walk. A neighbor said, let's take her to this healing rally that's going on. The mother reluctantly took her, but wasn't really expecting anything. And neither was Lisa. She didn't know what was wrong with her. Nobody laid hands on her there. Nobody prayed for her. But it was just an atmosphere where maybe she was praying for herself. I don't know. But where there was faith. Even if the person up front is a fraud, in this case, I don't think the person was a fraud, but even if the person up front is a fraud, God can still touch somebody whose heart is sincere. Anyway, she jumps out of her wheelchair and starts running around. Her mother's freaking out. No, you can't do this. And she ends up, as they walk into the door, she shocks her father by pushing her wheelchair in. She was not only healed of the cancer, but the x-rays afterwards showed that where her bone had been eaten away by the cancer, her bone was now restored. And this one is from Dr. Kasdorf, MD, PhD. He has the x-rays in his book. He consulted a number of other physicians. They actually presented this on a television program back in the 1980s, I think it was, 70s or 80s, where he presented the medical documentation for it. Just as an aside, what he also said that, the night before the TV interview, the TV studio had put them all up on, I forget what floor, maybe the 11th floor or something like that, in a hotel, different rooms. And they had dinner together in the restaurant that day. And then the next day was the interview. Well, after the dinner, the rest of them took the elevator. She ran up all those flights of stairs to the room just because she could do it. And she wanted to celebrate her healing. So
yeah,
God can heal people in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to focus on the ones that were more, what we might say, normal. Because people would be less likely to give questions about those.
Yeah, and the other thing that, I have often heard is something along the lines of, oh, well, of course, you have lower back pain. Everybody has lower back pain, so they'll pull you out of the crowd, and in the adrenaline rush, you'll feel better because of the endorphins being released and that sort of thing. So I just want to throw that out there for the odd listener or skeptical listener who's already pigeonholed this interview thinking, well, when you're talking about miracles, you must be talking about these faith rallies I see on TV. And when you're talking about healings, you must be talking about, someone with lower back pain and it got better. But no, you're seeing bones are back in place and, flesh that's been eaten away is restored and muscles that have been atrophied are back and working and people are curled from being paralyzed and their hands opening, So that's the reason I asked that, is not to poo-poo a rally or something like that, but to put those who might have that preconception in their mind, think of it a little bit different, because that's not the sort of thing you're documenting.
And not to say that lower back pain doesn't hurt.
Oh, yeah.
not to thank God, even for psychosomatic recovery, whatever, but I'm not using those as evidence.
Yeah, when it comes to talking to a skeptic and say, hey, I prayed this morning, my back felt better, and that's not going to do anything for them either. It would be better for me to say, hey, a bone grew back. You know what I mean? Yeah. If I'm trying to say, hey, there's an evidential case here that, look, naturalism kind of doesn't have an account for this. Christianity is falling in line with what the New Testament accounts are showing Jesus doing, So
I wonder, when we're talking about the way that skeptics view the evidence for miracles versus the way someone who is already a believer, or at least has, is much more open-minded about the supernatural or the existence of God than someone who's not. I wonder if you could speak to how presuppositions impact the way that we interpret the evidence. And also, if you have any experiences of how some of the evidence that you have uncovered and shared has challenged a skeptic or two that you know to maybe reconsider their presuppositions?
Yeah, I mean, everybody has a different bar of evidence they're looking for. I shouldn't say everybody, but and I think there's some appropriateness in that, because you can have somebody who's so naive that they just believe every report, like, somebody took photographs of heaven. Yeah, anyway. But then you can have people who are so skeptical that, like I said before, they wouldn't believe it, they said, if somebody were raised from the dead in front of them. Now, Hume never said that. I think Hume's bar of evidence wasn't actually as high as those people are raising it.
Right.
But even for myself, some of these things they've changed my own way of thinking, because, I mean, as a Christian, I believe in principle that miracles can happen. When I was an atheist, of course, I believed in principle that they didn't. Maybe an agnostic or neutral starting point would be to say maybe they happen, maybe they don't. But I was, I guess, maybe it was a carryover from my atheism, and maybe it was reinscribed with some of my academic training, where I put the bar of evidence pretty high. But after a number of these cases, eventually there was a turning point for me. And I think the turning point for me was probably when it came closer to home. I mean, there's something like the one I saw with Barbara, but that didn't really change my thinking. I was like, still, well, I can think of a way to get around this. It's not very probable, but maybe he just was lucky. And but then there were a number of these, and then finally there was this one report I'd heard about, and then I got to interview the person in Congo. This was Antoinette Malambe, and she said that her daughter Therese had been bitten by a snake. She wasn't breathing. There was no medical help available in the village, so she strapped the child to her back, ran to a nearby village where Koko Ngoma Moise was doing ministry. He was a family friend. He prayed for the child. Child started breathing again. The next day she was fine. Well, I know Therese. Therese has a master's degree now, so she didn't have any brain damage. I asked how long was it that she wasn't breathing, and her mother had to stop and think to get from this village to that village. She said about 3 hours. Now, 6 minutes with no oxygen, irreparable brain damage starts in. So I was like, wait a minute. Now I have accounts that are much more graphic than that. I have accounts that have more medical documentation. Obviously, there wasn't medical documentation in that case because there was no medical help available. That's why they needed a miracle. But this one got my attention because Therese is my sister-in-law and Antoinette Malambe is my mother-in-law. So that one was kind of close to home.
Wow.
And that one became kind of a turning point for, when I would interview people, taking them seriously enough, and not to doubt one's mother-in-law, but we did check it with the other witness, with Koko Ngoma Moise, and he confirmed the account.
Wow. I doubt my mother-in-law all the time. Don't worry about it. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh. What if she's listening?
Yeah, I'm just kidding. She's great. She's great. In the book, you explain succinctly for readers that his famous argument against miracles, basically, we've kind of addressed the idea that, first miracles are a violation of natural law, and the issue there being, well, you kind of defined it in a way that it's easy to debunk, which nobody really thinks that's what a miracle is anyway. I mean, as far as an informed theist, I've never heard them define it that way. But then second, that uniform human experience warns against trusting miracle reports. Now, I'm always fascinated when there are certain skeptics that talk about Hume like he's buried miracles. I mean, it's a done deal, right? I think of Christopher Hitchens, that was his rebuttal to miracle claims or claims to the miraculous. Well, Hume's put that to bed. So can you unpack just kind of that second part of the argument there, that uniform human experience warns against trusting it, and kind of why you think it ultimately fails? Yeah.
And there have been objections to that argument for, ever since Hume came out with it, including probability theorists, those who came up with some of the foundations for probability theory, one of their first uses for that was to show that Hume's claim didn't work. But ultimately, it is a circular argument. It's like, well, we can't trust eyewitnesses unless they're credible. So what happens if you have credible eyewitnesses? Well, we can't really trust them because what they're saying is against uniform human experience. I mean, that's a circular argument if you've ever had one. Anyway, there are, Hume could get away with it in his day. I don't think he himself would use that argument today. Hume was a smart man. And today, there was a Pew Forum survey, maybe a decade and a half ago, that interviewed Pentecostals and charismatics in just 10 countries and concluded that the total number of Pentecostals and charismatics in those 10 countries who claim to have witnessed or experienced divine healing comes out to somewhere around 200 million people. Now, that's just in 10 countries, and that's just Pentecostals and charismatics. But as a control group, they also interviewed what they called other Christians. So if you don't like Pentecostals or charismatics,
there's
you've got
the others.
You don't like other Christians either. But anyway, you've got, somewhere around 39% of those claim to have witnessed or experienced divine healing. Now, nobody's going to say that all of those are, genuinely miracles. Nobody's certainly going to say that all those can only be explained as miracles. But when you've got hundreds of millions of people making these claims, you can't just start with the premise that uniform human experience excludes something. You have to start looking at some of the claims. And yeah, some of the claims are bogus. But just because there's counterfeit money doesn't mean we don't use the real thing. And just because there are quacks, happily not nearly as many today, because we have a standardized medical industry today as opposed to 2 centuries ago. But just because there are quacks doesn't mean we're not going to use medicine. There's the real thing, and there are, like we said, there are plenty of cases of this where we have the medical documentation, or we have multiple independent eyewitnesses, or both.
Thank you. That was helpful.
I have a question regarding evidence, and that is this idea that, it seems that many object to eyewitness reports and they'll dismiss them as soon as they hear the date that it happened. Like, for example, the 1970s, well, that's not legitimate. Or the other objection is, that's something in Africa or some other country, so that's not legitimate. So it's almost as if time and distance seem to immediately invalidate evidence for a lot of people. Have you seen this, or what are your thoughts on that sort of a thing?
In terms of events from 1970s, I mean, we have an account of what appears to be a raising from the dead in John Wesley's journal. And you can say, well, okay, that's from the 1700s. But it was from the date on which it occurred that he recorded it in his journal, December 25th, 1742. So it's an eyewitness account from that date. I saw a storm stop when some students prayed. The storm was supposed to go on all day. It was pouring down rain. These students prayed for it to stop because we were going to have an outreach that day. And the storm stopped. And the sun came out the rest of the day. And that was back in the early 1990s. And you can say, well, you would have forgotten it by then. I wrote it in my journal that day. And most of these accounts are not just distant memories. I mean, with my mother-in-law and Coco Moise, I mean, that was over a period of decades. I don't know that had been written down. But in those cases, again, we have 2 independent witnesses. And it wasn't just, my mother-in-law's memory at that point. It was, this story had circulated in the family. So my wife knew about it and so on. But also in the case of happening in distant places, I did have one person object. They said, his stuff just comes from Congo, and that's where they kill babies as witches. And I'm like, okay, a few problems with this. First of all, my stories weren't all from Congo. I just had a handful of stories from Congo. That's because I knew those firsthand, because I interviewed, well, not firsthand, but I'd interviewed people, so I had them secondhand. But he hadn't read the book. He'd gotten that from an interview I'd done where they specifically asked me about Congo. Second problem is that this circle doesn't do that to anybody. It doesn't kill people. Third problem was he'd entirely mixed up the two Congos. Talking about ignorance. I mean, he was talking about DRC. This was the Republic of Congo, not the Democratic Republic of Congo, two different countries. But then the final thing is that's just racist. I mean, it's ethnocentric to just Hume, though. That goes back to Hume, and actually before Hume, it goes back to the deists when they said that anything from these are ignorant and barbarous peoples. So Hume dismissed anything from other cultures. He said, actually, in one of his other works, he said that there nothing advanced in terms of art or civilization has come out from any civilization except white civilization. It was outright racist. I mean, he supported slavery because he said black people can't think right. I mean, it's just very, very racist. So that was Hume's posture. But Hume said, well, it has to be from Western culture. So Hume then takes an example from Western culture. He takes the example of Blaise Pascal's niece. Of course, Blaise Pascal was brilliant mathematician and scholar and theologian, although he died very young. He was impacted by the Jansenist movement in France. His niece had a running eyesore that was organic. It emitted a foul odor. And when she was touched with the holy thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns. Now, I don't believe it was really a holy thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns. So, again, talking about things that may be fraudulent, but it was a contact point for her faith. She was instantly and publicly healed in the sight of many witnesses. And the Queen Mother of France sent her own physician to check it out. So Hume says, okay, here we have a story. It's better documented than anything in the Bible. I mean, here we have medical documentation. Here we have lots of eyewitnesses. The healing was public. It was something organic. How does Hume deal with that? He says, and this is from the Western world. Hume says, well, we know this didn't happen, so why would we believe anything else? And then he moves on. Now, that sounds to me like the kind of argument you make when you have to be right. So you're going to dismiss any kind of evidence that contradicts your argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds to me like you're essentially saying that, when somebody makes kind of that blanket statement of, oh, that's from 1970 or, oh, that's from a distant place, you don't get to object based on that. You've got to look at the evidence for that particular event.
Yeah. I mean, the X-rays in the case of Lisa Larios are from the 1970s. It's not like the X-rays lose their credibility because, it's
right.
It's since then.
Here's another thing that was great about the book, and I mentioned this, I think, before we started recording, that, I had certain questions on my mind before I looked at the book, and then I scanned through the book and I'm like, wow, he's answering all the questions. It's great. So, I was, some of my questions were along the lines of what I would normally think would be, having the skeptical hat on. So I do have one question that I want to start with, and that's, someone might say, what about capturing healings on video? We have got all this quote unquote documentation, but why don't you video it? Why isn't there stuff on video? And you sort of addressed that in the book. So would you mind just elaborating on that for a moment or two?
Sure. I mean, sometimes they are captured on video. Now, people can fake videos too, but I'm going to give you a case of one that just can't credibly be faked. Delia Knox had been, it was all over the internet. You can find all these things dated back when she was ill. I've talked with people who knew her back when she was ill, including her sister, including people from her church in Buffalo, people that I just met from that region who just happened to know of her back then. For over 20 years, she was a gospel singer from her wheelchair because she was paralyzed from the waist down. She couldn't feel her legs. And, talk about fraudulent things or at least misplaced faith. I mean, there were people who tried to jerk her out of her wheelchair, be healed, and she wasn't. But she still held on to the hope that maybe someday she felt like God was going to heal her someday, but someday could mean after Jesus comes back, obviously. That's when a lot of healing that's when it's for sure. But she had been holding on, believing that God would heal her. It was getting a little bit harder, 20 years in. But one day she was praying for somebody else, and suddenly feeling came to her legs. And so they wheeled her up front, or she wheeled herself up front and asked for prayer. And they prayed for her. And you have the video with them praying for her, and then she gets up and she's moving her hips under her own power. She has somebody on either side of her holding her up. Why? Well, her muscles have been atrophied for all this time. So she can feel her legs. She can actually move her legs, but she's not strong enough to stand on her own. So she's walking around with these people holding her up. And you look at what critics said on the internet, in the comments section. They said, "You call that walking? Look, she's got people holding her up." Well, she when somebody can walk immediately afterwards, they say, "Look, that's fake. Your muscles would be atrophied." So, but a month later, there's a video of her. She's had time to develop some muscle tone. There's another video of her walking into her church in Buffalo and walking under her own power and praying for other people. I've talked with the people, the before and after. The videos are also before and after. And there's no doubt that she had this condition before. The strongest criticism I heard with a comment afterwards was, well, she must have faked her inability to walk for 22 years just so she could claim a miracle afterwards. Sometimes when people have to go out on a limb like that, who in the world is gonna endure that for 22 years just so they can claim a miracle afterwards? If that's the best somebody can come up with, I think it's time to be skeptical of your skepticism and think about the alternative explanations.
Mm-hmm. Right. Dr. Keener, you mentioned how this young lady had prayed for over 20 years to be healed and was hanging on. And I wonder what you would say to somebody who might be listening. This is more of like a pastoral question. Mm-hmm. Who might be listening and might be thinking, gosh, I've been praying for 30 years for God to heal me from X, whatever that might be. What would be your encouragement to them? Why maybe they're struggling with why hasn't God healed me? Yeah, and I know that's a weighty question, but with someone of your stature who's looked into it so much, I'm genuinely curious what you'd say to that person.
Okay, now I'm switching to my theologian hat.
Yes. Absolutely.
But admitting that not everybody comes to the same conclusion. And I should say that if, like her faith was waning some over the years. It's not like her faith was perfect.
Sure.
Especially toward the end. It was when the feeling came back to her legs, she realized, oh, now something is happening. But when Jesus healed people, what the setting that we have in the Gospels and Acts is especially the setting of the kingdom going forth. It's especially groundbreaking evangelism. So it's not to say it's limited to those cases by any means. I have a number of cases in the book where it's something different than that. And a number of cases in the book where somebody really didn't think they were going to be healed. And there was the person praying for them who believed that they would be healed. And then they were. Somebody else was paralyzed on his left side. And it was actually a doctor who had me follow up with this person. The doctor's the one who said this was a miracle. And then I got the medical documentation for that one and so on. But in the Gospels and Acts, it was primarily groundbreaking evangelism. That's where most frequently we see these things today. And again, it's not to say it doesn't happen elsewhere, but there were people in the Bible who were not said to be healed. Trophimus I left at Miletus sick, 2 Timothy 4. Epaphroditus was sick close to the point of death, but God had mercy on him, so he did get healed, but not right away. In Philippians 2, Paul tells Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake and his often infirmities. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul himself mentions a bodily weakness in Galatians 4:13. Elisha died of a sickness, and I think it's 2 Kings 13 or 14. He died of a sickness, and yet he was so full of the power of God that when a corpse was thrown on top of him, the corpse came back to life, on top of his bones. So all that to say, it's not that a person doesn't have faith. It's not to say something bad about the person. None of the first century apostles are still alive. And if they hadn't been martyred, most of them, they still wouldn't all be alive today. Because healing is a sign, but it's a foretaste of the fullness of the kingdom. There's coming a day when God is going to heal us completely. He's going to wipe away every tear from our eyes. But when he heals anybody in the present, that foretaste is a reminder of God's promise. It's a reminder of God's faithfulness, of what he will do for all of us. So, if he heals somebody else, it's a gift to me too. But yeah, he often does heal, but it doesn't always happen in this life. But God is still trustworthy. So, I have one account from a doctor who, and this one, they have the death certificate and everything. The guy had been flatlined for 40 minutes. The doctor felt led to pray for the man. The man came back to life. No brain damage. And they actually travel around giving their testimony sometimes now. But that doctor, there's a backstory to this. His own son, Chad, died of leukemia before this. They prayed and prayed. He still died. And he said at that point he had to decide, am I going to lose faith or am I going to just determine I'm going to trust God no matter what? He chose the latter course. And that's why he was ready when he felt God lead him to pray for this other person. God is still trustworthy, and God does do miracles, even if it doesn't always happen every time that we pray.
Wow.
Well, thanks for that answer, Dr. Keener.
Yes.
Now, earlier I was saying that, there are certain questions I had kind of going in that I wanted to ask, that I had, internet questions and that sort of thing. There's one that I'm not going to ask, but I will tell the listeners you address, and that is the amputee question. Don't answer it here. I want them to, if they really want that answer, I'm going to send them to go pre-order your book, which is coming out in October. But you do address that, and you give something, an answer or two in there that hopefully people would find compelling. Yeah, well, leave it at that. You do interact with people on the internet, and so I'm sure you don't have time to sit there and play keyboard warrior with people in their basements all day. But there are a lot of objections you may hear commonly, Facebooky ones, YouTubey ones. And I wonder if there's any that are this is the most common misconception or a very common misconception. Would there be anything that pops out in your mind like that you would want to address?
Yeah, there's one person who goes around saying that my first book is entirely anecdotal. That's false. But like I said, not everybody actually read the book. But sometimes what people will say is, so what? Eyewitnesses can say anything. Eyewitness evidence is not evidence. If eyewitness evidence is not evidence, now again, that's not all I have in the book. We have medical documentation and so on, and you have eyewitness evidence from doctors and so on. That's where we get some of our medical documentation. But eyewitness evidence is a form of evidence in law, in journalism, in sociology, in anthropology, and certainly historiography, where I do most of my work. If you throw out the possibility of eyewitness evidence, you have to throw out entire disciplines, entire spheres of knowledge. We know almost nothing about ancient history apart from, coins and inscriptions and so on. If you throw out eyewitness evidence. Now, eyewitness evidence, you have to take certain precautions with it, but the people who say that, it's just naive. For each discipline, you use the epistemological approach appropriate to that discipline. And for many disciplines, it has to be at least a strong eyewitness component. And when we're talking about events that have happened, that are one-offs, it's not like it happens all the time. And if it did happen all the time, we'd say it's the course of nature. We wouldn't consider it. I think the course of nature is rather miraculous personally, but it's not what we normally call miraculous because it's not special divine action. It's general divine action. So yeah, if you are dealing with events that happened, eyewitness evidence is absolutely essential for that.
Well, I appreciate that. One of the other things is, we talk about a lot about healing, but what about people being raised from the dead? Are there good, credible, documented instances of that within the book?
Oh, yeah. Actually, I found so many cases of that. One of them actually is from, well, a couple of them are from the doctors themselves, but one of them is the doctor's own experience. Sean George, a consultant physician at Kalgoorlie Hospital in Australia, where he was flatlined. He died from a heart attack for an hour and a half. So talk about 5 minutes with no oxygen, 6 minutes with no oxygen. This is an hour and a half. And by that time, his wife, who was also a doctor, arrived, and also some of his other friends who were physicians at the hospital arrived. Now, some of them were Christians. His wife was a Christian. He was a Christian. But there were Hindu and Muslim doctors there who were eyewitnesses of this as well. When his wife prayed for him, his heart restarted. Now, his healing wasn't completely instantaneous because he still was unconscious for a few days. But when he woke up, he read his chart. He had no brain damage. No, all his systems had shut down. So you don't get those things back naturally at that point. And because he's a doctor, he, unlike many people, knows how to get the medical documentation. He's got it up on his website, and including the defibrillator logs and so on. And then, in terms of things not being psychosomatic, obviously it wasn't psychosomatic with him because he wasn't in any condition to hear anything. You also have healings of babies that can't be psychosomatic on their part. You also have the stilling of storms, which psychosomatic storms. Now that's a real problem. So one of my doctoral students, and he comes from a denomination where they really don't talk much about miracles today. I mean, they're not really used to that kind of idea. But he and 4 people who were with him were caught in the midst of a hailstorm that shattered the windshield that, looks like, well, there were F4 tornadoes in the area. We'll just say that the hail was flying horizontally at this point. He cried out to Jesus. Suddenly the storm stops. All storms stop, but the sun comes out. There's a rainbow. One of them did take a picture of that. I have, the testimony of all 5 of them in terms of credibility. I mean, he's a doctoral student that reads inscriptions. Actually, he's not a doctoral student anymore. He has his PhD. But, we've got so many things like that. And you can say, okay, well, that's just a coincidence. But at some point, you have to say, look how many of these are connected with somebody praying in the name of Jesus. So if you just take from my own immediate circle, the people who claim to be witnesses of people being raised, sometimes after hours of the person being thought dead, they recover consciousness and are fine when somebody prays for them in the name of Jesus. I've got like 10 people in my immediate circle, and it wasn't like they were out to tell me this. It was just, as I start inquiring around and they find out I'm talking about miracles, they, like one of them, a friend that I'd worked with, I asked him if he had any accounts because I knew he was in a cutting edge evangelism kind of situation. He said, well, not many. He gave me 7 pages. And one of them was this account where a child was brought to him. As far as anybody could tell, the child wasn't breathing. They said, you're a man of God. Can you do anything? This was a non-Christian context, but a theistic context. And he prayed for a couple hours, handed the child back to them alive. I was like, would you always pray for people who seem to be dead? Maybe once in a while you get it right. He said, no, but he had done it twice. He'd done it for his best friend. He didn't come back. But in this case, it was on the cutting edge of evangelism. The person came back. What are the odds that, in one person's immediate circle, they would know 10 people have witnessed this? Unless we're burying a whole lot of people prematurely, okay, you can say, well, that's a coincidence. Maybe it's a 1 in 10 billion coincidence. But 1 in 10 billion, if you're going to admit that and you're going to say that's a coincidence, you ought to admit that your argument is not very probable.
Mm-hmm. Well, and especially when you think about the cumulative effect of the arguments, or the accounts, at what point are you beginning to look unreasonable of your outright denial of all of them? Right. Like you said, certainly some of the claims that I'm not saying the ones in your book, but some miracle claims are certainly false. There's no getting around that. But certainly there's quite a bit of accumulation of people who claim to have experienced something supernatural. At what point are we starting to look silly by denying all of it?
Critically evaluating claims means we don't just a priori dismiss them all, and we don't a priori accept them all. We evaluate them critically. And there are levels of probability, and that's what we do in history. That's what I do when I do historiography, and I think that's what we need to do with claims today as well.
Yeah. Well, I have a question that I was really wanting to ask you. I have a dear friend, who I've been sharing Christ with. I mean, we've been discussing Christ and the things of God in the Bible and evidence for the existence of God and the resurrection and things like that. And he's been close a few times, but then he always comes back to this. He'll say something like, if Jesus would just appear to me, or if I would witness something miraculous, I would wholeheartedly follow him. That if I experienced a miracle or a miraculous encounter, I just wonder what would be your kind of advisement, or if you were in a situation and a friend of yours said something similar, what would be your encouragement to him, or what would you offer to maybe challenge that position?
If you have a traffic accident and an officer is interviewing witnesses, and somebody comes up and contradicts the witnesses and say, that's not what happened. And the officer says, well, tell me what you saw happen. And the person responds, well, I didn't see anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know it didn't happen. We wouldn't take that very seriously. I mean, in every other sphere, we're willing to accept credible eyewitness evidence. I mean, journalism would be pretty much impossible without that. I mean, today we have video recordings of some events and so on, but human rights advocacy, I mean, you have to interview witnesses, so many areas. So if you can't accept somebody else's testimony, don't say that there's no credible evidence. You can just say, well, I'm not going to believe this unless I see it, but I'm not being consistent with my epistemology in other ways. Because if somebody tells me that it's raining outside, or the weather report says it's 99% chance of rain, not always right. I mean, but 99 times out of 100, it'll probably be. So I'm going to probably listen to what they say. I'll take an umbrella. It seems to me that we need to be open to that and not use an epistemology that doesn't work on anything else.
Yeah, that's helpful, that issue of consistency.
As we kind of wind to a close here, I wanted to ask you, you've written that first 2-volume work on miracles in the New Testament, and now this next one, Miracles Today, the supernatural work of God in the modern world. I can't imagine you going through another book and not having some more like aha moments or like revelations of the goodness of God and just your own faith being strengthened, or something unique that you've learned this time around. Would there be anything like that you'd want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my faith is a whole lot, personally, my faith is a whole lot stronger after the reports and after some things I've seen in more recent times, and some things I remembered, from back when I would just kind of dismiss them as anomalous. But, there were enough of them when I stopped to think about them. Our worldview colors the way we see things. The glasses we wear colors the way we see things. And so there's plenty of evidence. I mean, the evidence from miracles, I think, is far less compelling than the evidence from DNA. I mean, the evidence that God has given us. But I'll take the miracles too. And if we're just depending on our own experience, like Hume, it's limited. But if we're willing to look at global experience, we have quite a lot of material to consider.
Well, Dr. Keener, it's been a real privilege having you on the podcast again. Thank you so much for coming on. Would there be a great place to point our listeners to find more of your resources, your books, your works?
Sure. I mean, they're on Amazon, but in terms of free material, there's plenty of it at craigkeener.com, all one word. Keener has 3 E's in it, 2 toward the front and 1 in the last syllable. So craigkeener.com. And also I have a YouTube channel. Most of my YouTube material is on different biblical books. Yeah, most of my material is in my books. Most of it is academic, but on a more readable level. Of course, there's Miracles Today, but also the IVP Bible background commentary. I did the New Testament notes except some of the sidebars, for the Cultural Background Study Bible with NIV, NRSV, and NKJV. And then a book that my wife and I did together called Impossible Love.
Cool. Well, for those who are listening, please go to craigkeener.com for those resources. Amazon has all the books. There's 30 plus of them. Great stuff. Please pre-order today the book Miracles Today, The Supernatural Work of God in the Modern World. Craig Keener, thanks so much again for being with us. And we always appreciate your work and want to recommend people go to it and let their faith be encouraged and strengthened as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian and Chad. It's been a real privilege to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Hey, do you love a good story? Great. Then you got to check out the #Storytime podcast. Each episode brings you the craziest, creepiest, and cringiest stories from YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and beyond.
My story is about the time that I was broken up with at the 9/11 memorial. Twice.
Look, the internet is a dumpster full of stories, and I, your host, Will McFadden, dive in headfirst, sift through the flaming trash, and bring you nothing but treasures. Listen to all 21 episodes of #Storytime now on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Picture yourself here. White sugar sand beach, clear blue-green water. This is Pensacola. It's the way to beach. Experience what's waiting at visitpensacola.com.